Good morning, YouTube America and my fellow gamers. Another installment of my reviews of the stuff off of my bookshelf, dust and all. I come across one of the books that I haven't seen in a long time, and I remember when I first bought it, and I looked at the content, kind of grazed over it, and thought, I really don't need this. I really don't. I really don't need this book, other than the fact that it was part of an additional part of the growing set. And sometimes I don't know about you, but sometimes I'll buy something. Mostly because I've got the rest of the stuff and I want that piece too because it's just another piece. And then it sits on the shelf and goes ignored. Now, I never not open the cellophane and pursue it, breeze through it and glance at it and stuff. But sometimes I don't do it. I don't give it a fair chance right away, and it goes back up on the shelf and just sits there. And then at some point, I'll be utterly bored, or I need something, and I just can't. I'm going through book after book trying to find the answer to a quandary, and bang, here comes this old book off the shelf, and I'm like, I think I've read this book one time 10 years ago, and this is one of those books. Now, the complete book of Villains. Now, ironically enough, I've seen a lot of books of this venue, similar types, but usually what they are is a compendium of pre-generated bad guys. So you can, as a quick reference guide, you can pop in, yank out this one or that one, and put them into your game system, and not have to go through a lot of effort yourself as a GM to concoct them. Not what this is about. This one here is about creating bad guys, or creating the villains, running them, motivating them potentially. And we don't think a lot about that. I mean, I can't say that for every GM. I know myself a lot of times. I fire things off the hip. I create a bad guy out of thin air, and basically all I've done is made another NPC using the same formula the players use to make their characters. I made one for the bad guys, and I made it appropriate challenge level for my playing gaming group. And then I've always, not always, but almost always learned a long time ago not to go into heavy backstory at the beginning. Let the characters develop themselves. Let the NPCs develop themselves. The more we know about the background on something, the more depth we can give it. Except sometimes there's not necessary to have 5 pages of backstory for a merchant. The local leathersmith that your player characters are only going to visit once every 10 weeks, if that. Right? You spend an awful lot of effort and time in creating something that, for all intents and purposes, was a waste of your time, and that's not always a good thing. On the other hand, sometimes we want to develop this particular persona more, and it can be a challenge, in part because we're not villains ourselves. That's one of the that's kind of a core foundation brick of role playing in general, is trying to put yourself into the shoes of something you're not, and going around wielding a broadsword and screaming in Darthaki or whatever is generally not what you do. It's a challenge. Well, if you're not a villainous person, you're not evil at heart or have a dark mind, if you will. I make the difference there, not twisted mind, because I ain't met very many gamers that ain't a little twisted. But having a dark mindset and doing it well without going overboard, well, that comes with experience and work. And if it comes to you naturally, you're either one heck of an actress or actor, or maybe you need to seek out some therapy, just to be safe. Just saying, so nothing really truly bad happens. As I said, when I reviewed the book, and I picked it off my shelf here a few days back, I don't know where you do most of your light reading. My time is fluid, so to speak. There are times where I'll have blocks of minutes where I've got nothing to do, and picking up a book is a good way to pass that time. There are others where it's almost a given that when I'm visiting the throne, so to speak, I want to have something in my hands to help pass the time because don't. There's a place and time to rush, and rushing things can sometimes lead to unhealthy complications you don't need. Anyway, so I grabbed this book and I set it down and was going through some of the beginning stuff, and I'm thinking, oh yeah, now I remember why I got this book, and it's just I don't know why I even brought it off the shelf. But then I got into it a little further, and sometimes that's what it takes. You have to go back a couple times and read something and take in what is going on here below the scenes, so to speak. You know, the whole first section is basically setting up your bad guy. Things like the surroundings, the history, does he have a network, reviewing your process. Then you goes into fleshing out your villain. And this is basically, you've already taken the NPC creation rules and created the character. And now we're going to things like create interest through contrast, interview your villain, what's his occupation, his attitude, what's his tastes and preferences, what's her history, what's she look like. Then you can get getting some ideas, live fiction, dice rolling, blah, blah. And there's some good stuff in here that's not related to the villain at all. I mean, getting ideas from a GM's perspective, finding ways to come up with interesting scenarios sometimes is a challenge. And I know this comes up, and a lot of people bring it up, and mention it, and it works, and I'll bring it up too. We're surrounded by it. You pick up any newspaper, watch the TV news, and you can get some inspiration. And sometimes inspiration comes from reading other books, playing other people's games. It's plagiarism's a fine line. We're not publishing something. You can plagiarize all you want. If you're publishing something, make darn sure that it is unique enough to avoid that problem. When we talk about the villains, is he part of an organization? What's the hierarchy? A whole section on helping you set that up. And some of that, would be, to me, is common sense. I know the concepts behind it, and I don't need to go into great depth and have a flow chart and name all the top people and this, that, and the other thing. I allude that he's part of an organization, or she belongs to some network, and occasionally we'll throw in a contact or some sort of piece of it. But for the most part, I leave the bigger stuff in the shadows, if you will, because it makes that particular bad guy more interesting and more of a challenge to the players. And of course, as a GM, you can find some good stuff in here as things like plot development, and it goes on, different types, villain first method, linear versus matrix, a linear adventure, building a linear adventure, the matrix adventure, the time matrix, the power matrix, space matrix, the third option, enters the villain. What are the villain's circumstances? What just happened to the villain? Then we get into some other stuff in here that starts to really, like I said, starts pulling you out of it and bringing you back in. Like I said, he also got, like always, awesome artwork in here, and which my wife has taken to recently plagiarizing to some degree onto mirrors and etching them and trying to sell them on eBay. I don't know if they'll do well. They won't sell at all. I'm just encouraging her to do things, her hobby, because she tolerates so much from mine. What do you do? We talk about villains and then monsters as henchmen. Your villain's not. Should your villain be alone? Should he have some flunkies? He has some tools, so to speak, that he uses. Then we talk the section here on reoccurring villains, a good reoccurring villain, keeping track of your villains. Now that's something I'm a fan of. I've preached on this before. I don't believe that an NPC, even most monstrous bad guys, most monstrous foes, are suicidal. I don't think they're going to fight to the death unless you corner them into a situation where they don't have an option. And even then, they still have an option of throwing their weapons down and pleading for mercy. And if your group is supposedly good base, they're going to give them some mercy. And then the bad guys can come back and get them later. Most often than not, they cut and run. You knock somebody down to less than half their hit points. I've always started. To me, I start rolling a secret role to check their motivation. I might toss in their wisdom modifier, you know, to decide whether they know it's time to run or not. And then if they get below 25% of their hit points, they're at this point they are going to leave. They're going to look for an exit strategy, and the first opportunity they flee. And hopefully your people don't shoot them in the back. If they do, then that's the nature of those people. And sometimes it works out that way. But they go into great detail in stuff, and here's a whole chapter on dealing with these villains, not necessarily just as the arch foe, but as a challenging rival, as a detriment to continuing what your players' goals are. What if they're adventuring in a community and some local Yahoo decides they don't like adventurers, and they go out of their way to cause as much problems for your players as possible. That's a bad guy. Is he worth cutting his head off? Well, I guess that depends on the player characters. Um, and then of course we got into depths of other stuff. The sympathetic enemy, the faceless villain, the enemy warrior, public companion. Hey, there's something we don't think about. The villain could be, like I said, the community. Oh, we don't like your kind here, or we've had enough adventurers in our town. Get out. Or is it every time you come, the orcs follow? Why is that? That's because you keep raiding their lair. You know, I would imagine that the town people get tired of that. Another thing we don't consider from the villains is the motivations, long term motivations of those villains. Now, those villains have goals, wants, and desires as well. Maybe they're in competition with the player characters for a particular MacGuffin. We want the arc of the whatever, and the bad guy wants it too for different reasons. And the players originally started out to obtain the artifact to turn it over to somebody or to gain a reward, or maybe because of some power that they heard that it has, and then they run into their competition. Now, maybe the competition is not necessarily evil people. It could be another group of adventurers. It could be a local, nobleman who wants that for his private collection, and sends his collectors out to get it. And you're bumping swords with them now. There's a lot of variety and opportunities. Uh, then there's we can vanquish the villain. Did we kill him or not? Like I said, if he manages to escape and run away, or she manages to bamboozle her way out of the situation, that sets up timing for a later date. Now, I won't necessarily turn around and throw that same villain at him in the next scenario, the next game session. I mean, sometimes maybe it's necessary. The campaign's laid out that way, and it just got to keep proceeding until you've utterly driven this person off or destroyed their power base. But if it's not so, then some later date, these individuals can come back and become a thorn in the group's side again. And there's at that point, a little bit of familiarity from them will be oh my, it's Red the Beard. Oh, gee, like that, we got rid of him 6 weeks ago. Well, apparently not. And, it adds to my toolbox of ready NPCs to toss out. It's, and like I said, when it comes to encounters, uh, not every encounter needs to be in bloodshed. One of the toughest encounters, I guess, the toughest concept for encounters is when you're in an urban environment, when you're in the town, in the city, because the implication or the desire to immediately draw swords and go to town against somebody is not always a good thing, and if it causes the players problems in the community, so to speak, puts them in a bind. Sometimes it's more interesting to have those encounters be something that's non-lethal and minded. You see Red the Beard at going into the back door of some shady place, or you've seen him across a crowded marketplace, and when you lock eyes with him, and he gives a knowing scowl that he's acknowledging your presence, and then by the time you get over to where he's at, he's disappeared into the crowd or whatever. And then maybe that's the only time you see this guy again for another 3 or 4 weeks. because he has, the villains have lives of their own. The NPCs have lives of their own. That's kind of the concept here. They do go and do things. They're not just sitting in stasis somewhere. As soon as the players walk off the stage, the villains don't just walk into the corner and just slump into a chair. Unless I don't know. I guess maybe it depends on how you want to run them. They have their own goals, needs, and wants and lives to pursue, and encountering them in non-lethal combat and non-lethal situations sometimes can be interesting. It's just like I have in the past used old villains to help a player character group, a group of players, against a new villain in indirect means. Perhaps they've encountered Red the Beard 2 or 3 times over the past year, and a new situation arises, and of course, right away they predict it's him, and then when it turns out to not be him, they push him out of their mind, and then they get into a bind or into a situation, or they need a push, and Red the Beard appears out of thin air and gives them a nudge in the right direction, or drops a dime on his fellow villain, and it's not doing it because it's out of the goodness of his heart or some need for uh, uh, to pay back society. He's got his own motivations. Maybe he just doesn't like the other bad guy, or maybe he doesn't like the new bad guys moving in on what he perceives as his turf, or just maybe he's hoping the new bad guy will wipe your group of player characters out for him. He's determined that he can't arrange it himself. If he can help nudge your people along into something that they can't handle, he wins. It's a win-win for everybody. I don't go out of my way, though, as a GM, to tell my players what his motivations are. That's something they should find out on their own. Let them find out what motivates the bad guy. At least that's my philosophy. And like I said, you get into these books, and sometimes you got to look, and you go, I never thought of that, or this is actually not a bad idea. Uh, the rival or the competition, that's something that it's a theme I've played a number of times. It's a group of bad guys who are basically rivals to the player characters. They all are after the same goal or a similar goal, and they keep bumping shoulders, if you will. Maybe the kings put out a bounty for something, and you get out there, and here's Red the Beard, and he's looking at you, and he's got his 3 henchmen with him, and he's looking at you and your group, and you're thinking, oh, we're gonna have to have a fight. And the Red the Beard says, boys, this guy's out of your league. You just go back to the bar, go back to the tavern, get yourself drunk, grab some barmaid, whatever it is you do to entertain yourselves in the evening, and let the real professionals here take care of the problem. See you later. And then you got a competition. You got the bad guy who's chasing a new bad guy, and your player characters are tempted to wipe out both bad guys, when they got to keep in mind what's the goal of the game. And they get focused on Red the Beard, and I've seen it happen, focused on getting some payback, so to speak, from the old bad guy, that they let the new bad guy do what he needs to do, and next thing you know, we got a big problem. Or a bigger problem for another day. Not always bad about that. Okay, so they talk about section, like I said, leaving your villain out, an opportunity to him to get out, to escape, to disappear in a puff of smoke or whatever. Maybe you cut the bridge out from under him, and you think did he die? Did we actually see him die? We've seen him falling in a pile of rubble and dust, and screams go all the way down, and then nothing. And maybe how does it work out? Or the other side of the coin, and this sometimes is hard for a GM who invests so much time. Our characters, if you will, the GM's characters, are everybody that the players are not. So all the NPCs, the bad guys, so to speak, that's what the GM is doing. Is the motivator and the puppeteer for all the rest. And sometimes you invest a lot of time and effort into somebody and develop a character, and it gets where you just don't want to let go of it. Now here's another one that I've done it several times, and actually it turns out to be halfway decent. It's called the guest run villain. Now it's tough to run two separate groups of that nature at the same table. And sometimes you get somebody come in, we're at somebody's house and their brother's there or their cousin's there, and she wants to play, and she's, you go, okay, well, we have a regular session here with a regular group. Throwing an ad hoc person in sometimes can be a problem. I've learned several ways of coping with that and still allowing the person to play. Uh, the brief NPC interaction, the hanger on, whatever. These people come, they go, they're there, and then they're not there. Having them play the bad guy in a scenario. Now, basically, at that point, you're a mediator. The GM becomes the mediator between two rival groups, two rival situations, and your guest is role playing the bad guy in an encounter. So we don't. This is when the bad guys and the NPCs or the group have run into each other, and we're going to have a confrontation, and we're going to have a battle royale or whatever, and allowing somebody else to play that character for it adds a new depth to it sometimes. It can also be frustrating for the DM's perspective because, they're thinking, Red the Beard would never act that way. He would not act that way. And then you have to sit back and go, okay, maybe he's having a moment. Maybe he is acting that way out of pure frustration because everything else he's tried does not seem to work. Hey, whatever it takes. Sometimes it can be the chaos factor jumps in, and it can be in an interesting variation. So, like I said, to reiterate on this thing, it's not necessarily a bad book itself. There's a lot of good stuff in here, a lot of helpful tips and tools. What you won't find in the second edition of AD&D, the complete book of villains, is a bunch of pre-made villains. That's not what this is about. The game system or the game supplement is to give you conceptual idea and structure for creating really good villains and bad guys. Sometimes you just got to learn to make do with what you got. And other times you need these source books, this sort of thing, to expand on what you built, especially if you've gotten a little dry or you've backed yourself in a corner. Like I said, these books, 30 years old in some cases, maybe a little older, maybe a little younger, easy to find, not likely to be overly expensive. You probably even get a PDF variant of it today. I recommend that you buy some of these and put them on your shelf with your toolbox because you just never know how useful they are until you try pick one up.